The cabin was silent until a toy plane clattered into the aisle. A wealthy passenger sneered, demanding the commoners in seat 22B be moved. Despite paying for their tickets, the single father and his young daughter were publicly humiliated. The captain arrived not to defend them, but to bark an order. "Sir, change your seat immediately." The father complied, moving to the back in silence. But as the engines roared, he sent one encrypted message. Little did the crew know, the man they just insulted didn't just buy a ticket, he owned the entire airline. Revenge was boarding. The hum of the engines was a low, rhythmic vibration, a sound Daniel Cross knew better than anyone. It was the sound of progress, the sound of his empire. But today, he wasn't here as a tycoon. He wasn't the man whose signature appeared on multi-million-dollar acquisition contracts. He was just Daniel, a 41-year-old single father, trying to make a lasting memory for his daughter, Lucy. Lucy was 7, and this was her very first flight. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the tiny lights of the cabin like stars. To anyone passing by, they looked like an average family on a tight budget. Daniel wore a plain navy jacket, slightly faded at the elbows, worn-out jeans, and a watch that looked more functional than fashionable. He chose economy class, specifically to keep things grounded for Lucy. He didn't want her to grow up thinking life was all silk pillows, private terminals, and champagne. He wanted her to see the world as most people do, to understand the value of a dollar and the importance of patience. But Daniel Cross was far from ordinary. He was a silent titan of the skies, a discreet aviation investor who bought, sold, and leased entire fleets through complex shell companies. He owned the very wings carrying them today. This flight was what he called an incognito inspection, a way to see how his staff treated the people who paid for the cheap seats when they thought no one important was watching. "Daddy, what was that sound?" Lucy whispered, clutching her small plastic toy plane. Her voice was full of wonder, the kind of pure curiosity that Daniel cherished. Daniel smiled, his voice patient and warm, the kind of voice that could calm a storm. "That's just the luggage doors closing, sweetie. It means the plane is getting ready to fly. It's like the plane is taking a deep breath before it jumps into the clouds." He spent the next 30 minutes explaining the mechanics of flight in a way a 7-year-old could understand. He talked about lift, about the wind, about how the engines work like giant fans. His voice was a low murmur, a steady stream of comfort, but in the quiet cabin, even a whisper can carry. A few rows ahead, in the premium economy section, a man in a sharp, expensive gray suit shifted in his seat. He was checking his gold watch every 30 seconds, radiating a sense of extreme self-importance. His name tag on his briefcase read, Arthur Vane, a man used to getting his way. To him, the sound of a curious child wasn't a joy, it was an invasive nuisance. He turned around, throwing a cold, sharp glance towards seat 22B. His nostrils flared as if he were smelling something unpleasant. Arthur Vane wasn't just wealthy, he was entitled. He believed the world should rearrange itself to fit his comfort. He looked at the scuff marks on Daniel's shoes and the simple way Lucy was dressed, dismissing them as inconveniences rather than fellow travelers. He muttered under his breath about low-class families, ruining the travel experience for serious professionals. To him, the back of the plane was a place for people who didn't exist in his world, and he resented their proximity to his premium space. He began to drum his fingers rhythmically on his armrest, a clear sign of his dwindling patience. Lucy, unaware of the growing tension, accidentally let her toy plane slip from her tiny fingers as she mimicked a takeoff. It clattered onto the floor, rolling a few inches into the aisle, landing just near the edge of the carpet. Arthur Vane snapped. He didn't pick it up. He didn't even look at Lucy. Instead, he pressed the attendant call button with aggressive force, 3 times in rapid succession. Ding, ding, ding. A flight attendant arrived quickly, her expression professional but clearly strained. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" Vane pointed a trembling finger at Daniel. "Is there a reason I have to listen to a lecture on aerodynamics for the whole trip? This isn't a classroom. And now, there's trash in the aisle. It's a safety hazard. This is exactly why I pay for a higher class. To avoid this kind of domestic clutter. Deal with it immediately. The attendant looked at the small toy, then at Daniel. She didn't offer a smile, not even a polite greeting. She saw the worn jeans and the simple jacket and made a split-second judgment. "Sir," she said to Daniel, her tone clipped and cold, "please keep your child quiet. We need to maintain a peaceful environment for all our passengers, especially those who require rest. And please, keep your belongings inside your seating area. This is a shared space, not your living room. We cannot have objects rolling around the cabin during taxiing." Daniel felt a sharp sting of disappointment, not for himself. He had thick skin, but for the lack of basic human empathy shown to a child. He leaned over and picked up the toy, leaning close to Lucy, who was now looking down at her lap. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the attendant. "She's just excited for her first flight. We'll be more careful." "Excitement is fine," the attendant replied, already turning her back. "But silence is preferred. We have high standards on this airline, and we expect our passengers to respect them regardless of their ticket price." The air in the cabin grew heavy, suffocating. Lucy stopped asking questions. She stopped looking out the window. Her small shoulders slumped, and she looked like she wanted to disappear. Daniel held her hand, feeling the first sparks of a quiet, calculated frustration. He was seeing the true face of his airline, the culture he had inadvertently allowed to grow, and he realized that his standards were being used as a weapon against the very people he served. The tension didn't stay at a simmer. It began to boil as the aircraft began its long taxi toward the runway. The cabin lights dimmed, and the safety video began to play. Lucy, trying to be brave, reached for her water bottle to take a sip, but her hands were shaking slightly from the scolding. Her hand slipped, and for the second time, the toy plane fell. It was a small noise, a soft plastic click against the carpeted floor. But for Arthur Vane, it was the ultimate insult. He didn't just press the button this time. He stood up, unbuckling his seatbelt while the fasten seatbelt sign was still illuminated. "This is absolutely ridiculous," he barked, his voice echoing through the entire cabin, drowning out the safety instructions. "I paid for a premium experience, a quiet journey, not a seat in a daycare center. This is the second time. Either move them, or I'm filing a formal complaint against this entire crew the moment we land. I know you're CEO. I know people in the ministry. I will not be harassed by the presence of people who clearly can't follow basic instructions." The lead flight attendant, a woman named Sarah who prided herself on handling difficult situations, rushed over. "Sir, please sit down. We are moving. It's for your safety. I understand your frustration, but we must remain seated." "Safety? What about my sanity?" Vane shouted, ignoring her and pointing at Lucy, who was now trembling. "Look at them. They don't belong here. They're distracting everyone and creating a hostile environment for the rest of us who actually matter on this flight." Sarah turned to Daniel. Her face was a mask of polite intolerance, the kind of mask that hid a deep-seated arrogance. She looked around at the other passengers, seeing a few nodding in agreement with Vane, and decided to take the path of least resistance. "Sir, for the comfort of the cabin and to avoid further escalation, I'm going to have to ask you to move. We have an empty row in the very last section of the plane. It's more private. You and your daughter will be much more comfortable there. It's better for everyone. We need to clear this tension before takeoff." Daniel looked at her, his eyes calm but piercing, searching for a shred of fairness. The comfort of the cabin, or the comfort of one man who is shouting and breaking safety rules by standing up? "It's for the general harmony of the flight, sir," she replied, her voice tightening with a hidden threat. "We have the right to reassign seating for operational reasons. Please, gather your things now. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Daniel didn't move. He felt Lucy's small hand trembling in his. "I paid for these seats. I chose them weeks ago. My daughter is sitting quietly now. I don't believe we've broken a single rule of conduct. If anyone is causing a disturbance, it's the man standing in the aisle." Arthur Vane laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that made Lucy flinch. "Rules? You think the rules are the same for everyone? People like you don't understand how the real world works. Some people matter more on this flight than others. My time is worth more than your entire year's salary. I am a gold member of this airline's partner program. You're just a seat filler. Move, or I'll make sure you never fly this airline, or any other, ever again." Before Daniel could respond, before the situation could turn into a physical confrontation, the cockpit door opened. The captain stepped out. He was a man with gray hair, a stern face lined with decades of responsibility. He carried the weight of 30 years in the air. He looked at the VIP, then he looked at the attendant, and finally, his gaze landed on Daniel in seat 22B. The cabin went dead silent. The only sound was the air conditioning and the distant whine of the engines. Everyone expected the captain to reprimand the shouting man. Everyone expected justice. Instead, the captain looked at Daniel and spoke with a voice like cold iron. "Sir, I've been briefed on the situation by my lead. I agree with my crew. You do not fit the profile for this section today. Your presence and your child's behavior are causing an unnecessary disturbance to our valued guests. We have a schedule to keep and a standard of peace to uphold." Lucy's grip on Daniel's hand became painfully tight. She looked terrified, her eyes welling with tears she was trying so hard to hide. "Daddy, did I do something wrong? Are we bad?" Daniel felt a surge of protective rage, a fire he hadn't felt in years. But he didn't explode. He kept his face a perfect mask, a skill he had mastered in 1,000 boardrooms. He looked the captain in the eye. "So, this is your official decision? As the commander of this vessel, you are ordering me to move because of a plastic toy and a child's curiosity?" The captain nodded, cold and indifferent. "Change your seat immediately, or I will have security waiting for you at the gate for refusing a crew member's command. We don't have time for a debate. We have a runway slot to catch. Move to the back." Daniel took a long, deep breath. He stood up, slowly, with a dignity that seemed to fill the cramped space. He didn't look at Arthur Vane, who was wearing a smug, ugly grin of victory. He didn't look at the other passengers who were whispering and filming on their phones. He only looked at his daughter. "It's okay, Lucy," Daniel said, his voice loud and steady, vibrating with an authority no one yet understood. "We're going to move, but I think the captain is right. I really don't belong in this seat. This airline, this crew, they've shown me exactly where I belong." He began to gather their bags. He picked up the toy plane and tucked it into his pocket. The air was thick with judgment. Other passengers began to murmur, some with sympathy, but most with a sense of relief that the problem was being removed. To the world, the lowly single dad had been defeated by the system. The bully had won. The crew had restored order, or so they thought. If you believe you should never judge a person by the seat they are assigned, subscribe now so you don't miss the moment everything flips upside down. Daniel sat down in the very last row. Row 45, the shame row, right next to the humming lavatories and the clatter of the galley. Lucy sat tucked under his arm, quiet, her spirit dampened. The flight took off, the engines roaring as they climbed through the clouds. Once the fasten seatbelt sign turned off, Daniel reached into his jacket pocket. He didn't pull out a cheap wallet. He pulled out a sleek, matte black smartphone, a custom-built device. He opened an encrypted app, one that required a multi-factor biometric scan. With a few quick, precise taps, he sent a high-priority message to the airline's Global Operations Command Center in London. The message was brief. Security code Alpha. Tail number N422DC. Grounding inspection in progress. Verify owner identity immediately. Seat 45C. Pilot and crew evaluation. Critical failure. Protocol breach. Discrimination and safety negligence. In the cockpit, 30,000 feet above the earth, A piercing red light began to flash on the secondary communication screen. This wasn't a standard air traffic control message. It was a goal-level alert, a signal that triggered an automatic notification to the board of directors. It only activated if the literal owner or the chairman was communicating. The co-pilot checked the screen. His face went from pale to ghost white. He rubbed his eyes, checking the authentication code 3 times. "Captain," the co-pilot whispered, his voice trembling so much he could barely speak. You need to see this. Right now." The captain leaned over, his brow furrowed with annoyance. "What is it? We're climbing to cruise." He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes locked onto the owner's digital signature. He looked at the seat assignment mentioned in the internal data. Row 45, seat C. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The man he had just humiliated, the disturbing passenger he had treated like trash, was the man who signed his 6-figure paychecks, the man who owned the plane, the fuel in the tanks, and the very ground they were heading toward. The captain didn't say a word. He stood up, his movements frantic, nearly tripping over his own feet. He pushed past the cockpit door and ran, literally ran, toward the back of the plane. The passengers watched in total confusion. Arthur Vane looked up as the captain sprinted past, expecting him to perhaps offer a personal apology for the delay. But the captain ignored him entirely, nearly knocking over Sarah, the lead flight attendant, who was preparing the drink trolley. "Captain, where are you?" She started, but he was already gone. He reached the last row. He stopped, breathing hard, his chest heaving. Daniel was sitting there, calmly reading a picture book to Lucy, acting as if nothing had happened. The captain stood at attention, his shoulders back, his hands shaking visibly at his sides. His face was a mask of sheer terror. "Sir," he choked out. Mr. Cross." Daniel didn't look up from the book. "Is there another problem, Captain? Am I sitting too close to the bathroom? Is the sound of my daughter's page turning too loud for the back of the plane?" The lead attendant arrived, breathless. She saw the captain's face and her heart dropped into her stomach. "Captain, what's going on? Why are we at the back?" The captain turned to her, his voice a panicked, hissed whisper. "Shut up. Just shut up. Do you have any idea who this is?" He turned back to Daniel, bowing his head slightly, an act of total submission. I didn't know it was you, sir. The system didn't flag the name. The manifest just said D. Cross. I am so incredibly sorry. I was misinformed." Daniel finally looked up. His eyes were like ice, cold enough to freeze the cabin air. "The system didn't flag it because I didn't want it to. I wanted to see how my passengers are treated when there's no VIP tag next to their name. I wanted to see what happens when a father and a daughter are seen as less than because they chose to sit in the back." Arthur Vane, curious and emboldened, had walked back to see why the captain was hovering. "What's the holdup? Captain, why are you talking to this peasant? Is he refusing to stay in his place?" The captain spun around, his face turning a dark, dangerous red. "Get back in your seat and stay there if you ever want to fly on a commercial aircraft again. You have no idea who you are talking to. You are speaking to the chairman of the board. You are speaking to the man who owns this airline." The VIP's smug grin vanished instantly. It was replaced by a look of such profound shock that he actually stumbled backward. He looked at Daniel, the man in the simple jacket, then at the captain, then back at Daniel. The silence in the cabin was now absolute. The ordinary man was suddenly the most powerful person in the sky. The captain and Sarah were practically begging now. They were offering everything. "Please, Mr. Cross, let us move you to the first-class suite. We have cleared it. It's empty. We can have your daughter's favorite snacks ready in seconds. We will personally attend to every need. We will serve you ourselves." Daniel stood up, slowly, holding Lucy's hand. He looked around at the other passengers in economy, the people who had watched the humiliation in silence. He didn't walk forward toward the luxury. He stayed right where he was, in row 45. No, Daniel said, his voice echoing with a quiet, terrifying strength. I paid for 22B. You moved me here. And since you've made such a public scene, I think we'll stay here in the back. It's a very good place to observe. You see more of the truth from the back of the plane. He looked at Sarah. You told me you needed to maintain a peaceful environment. You didn't maintain it. You surrendered it to the loudest, most arrogant person in the room. You chose the path of least resistance over the path of basic human decency. That is not the policy of this airline. That is a failure of character. He then looked at the captain, who looked like he was about to collapse. And you are the commander. You are supposed to be the final word on justice and safety. You followed a biased report instead of using your own eyes. You chose to bully a child rather than manage a difficult adult. You prioritized a valued guest over a human being. The captain looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. Sir, I was just trying to keep the flight on time. Go back to your cockpit, Daniel commanded. Fly this plane safely. That is your only job right now. Do not come back here again. We will discuss your future and the future of this crew with the board of directors the moment we touch down. The flight crew scrambled away, their faces drained of all color. Arthur Vane scuttled back to his seat, staring at his lap, his face burning with a shame so deep he couldn't even look at the attendants. He didn't say another word for the rest of the 4-hour flight. He didn't even ask for water. Lucy looked up at her dad, her eyes bright and curious again. Are we in trouble, Daddy? Why was the captain so scared? Daniel knelt down, smiling softly, his voice returning to that warm, patient murmur. No, Lucy, we aren't in trouble. We just reminded some people that every seat on this plane is important, and every person in those seats deserves respect. We're teachers today, sweetie. The rest of the flight was the quietest, most disciplined Daniel had ever experienced. The service was impeccable, not just for him, but for every single person in economy. The attendants were suddenly kind, attentive, and genuinely human. They looked at the passengers, really looked at them. Lucy was even gifted a brand new, limited edition model plane from the cockpit's emergency kit. She played with it quietly, a huge smile on her face. Daniel watched her, taking mental notes. He was seeing the change he wanted, even if it was born out of fear. His job was to make sure that in the future, it was born out of genuine care. When the wheels finally touched the tarmac, the atmosphere was one of profound, heavy reflection. As the plane taxied to the gate, no one rushed to stand up and crowd the aisle as they usually did. There was a lingering sense of awe and a significant amount of fear among the crew. Daniel and Lucy were the last to leave the aircraft. The captain was standing by the door, hat in his hand, looking like he had aged 10 years in a single flight. He didn't ask for mercy. He just stood there, waiting for the verdict. Safe landing, Captain, Daniel said, pausing at the door for just a second. Thank you, sir, the captain replied, his voice barely a whisper. I hope you can forgive the lapse in judgment. Daniel didn't answer. He walked through the jet bridge and into the terminal, Lucy skipping beside him, her toy plane held high. To the thousands of travelers passing by, he was just a man with a backpack and a kid. No one knew his name. No one knew his net worth. But back at the airline's headquarters, an emergency board meeting was already being called. An internal report, written by Daniel during the final hour of the flight, was sent before he even reached the taxi stand. The policy changed that very night. Customer priority was completely redefined. It wasn't about the price of the ticket anymore. It wasn't about the tier of the loyalty program. It was about the dignity of the person holding the ticket. Training programs were overhauled, emphasizing empathy and conflict resolution over appeasing VIPs. The loudest voice would no longer win. That evening, at dinner in their hotel, Lucy looked at her dad. Are you mad about the man who yelled, Daddy, or the captain? Daniel took a sip of his water, shaking his head. No, Lucy, I'm not mad. I'm grateful. Sometimes You have to be moved to the very back of the plane to see exactly what needs to be fixed at the front. You have to be treated like you don't matter, to remember why everyone else does. Because the true value of a person isn't found in the class of their seat, or the label on their jacket, or the gold on their wrist. It's found in how they treat those who have nothing to give them in return. Respect isn't an upgrade you buy with a credit card. It's the standard you carry in your heart. And on Daniel Cross's airline, from that day forward, that was now the only way to fly. He had saved his airline by remembering what it was like to be just a passenger. If you believe that everyone deserves respect regardless of their status, subscribe to follow our next stories and leave a comment below. How would you react if you were ordered to change seats like Daniel? Have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly because of their appearance? We want to hear your story.